Chapter 2 The White Indian. Captain Stevens's beard had grown more gray since Rebecca had last seen him, but otherwise he looked the same. He was a muscular man of middle height with a barrel chest and a ready smile. He warmly greeted his friends and family. Then he motioned to the boy. "This lad's name is Isaac Davidson," the captain announced. "He was captured by the Abenakis about 8 years ago. The Indians killed most all of his family, but they adopted Isaac into their tribe." The captain paused, and Rebecca shifted nervously from one foot to the other. Ever since the raid on her family's farm, her greatest hope had been that the Indians would someday sell Mama, Papa, and Benjamin to the French. The French might then ransom them back to the English, either for money or in exchange for French or Indian prisoners. But not all captives were ransomed. Although Rebecca tried hard not to think about it, she knew that some captives were killed by the Indians, and some died on the long, hard march to Canada. Other captives, like Isaac, were adopted by the Indians and raised as members of their tribe. Looking at Isaac, Rebecca couldn't help thinking about her baby brother. Mayhap Benjamin is growing up with an Indian family right now, she thought. Mayhap. Captain Stevenson's booming voice broke in on her thoughts. "A few months ago, Isaac's tribe met up with some of our soldiers," the captain continued. "There was a battle, and afterward the soldiers found young Isaac among the Indians taken prisoner. The soldiers discovered that the boy still has kin, an aunt and uncle living in New York. His kinfolk want him back, so we're keeping Isaac here till they travel up and claim him." A murmur spread through the crowd. Several people pressed toward Isaac. They had friends or family who had been captured by the Indians, and they hoped for news of their loved ones. One woman tugged at the sleeve of the boy's homespun shirt. "Have you heard of a girl called Hope Adams?" she implored. "She was taken 4 summers ago, just south of here." Isaac's face showed no emotion. He shook his arm free from the woman's grasp, but she continued her plea. "She's my niece, and she'd be 10 years old now. She had bright red curls. Have you seen a girl like that?" Celinda whispered to her sister. "Perchance he's seen Mama or Papa or baby Benjamin. Let's ask him." "Wait," Rebecca whispered back. She watched Isaac as he ignored the woman. His horse, spooked by the crowd, reared up. Isaac did nothing to control it, and the crowd backed away. A soldier grabbed the horse's reins and steadied it. Several people in the crowd began talking among themselves. "That boy's been too long with the Indians," Rebecca heard one man say to his friend. "Looks to me like he's become a savage himself." "Aye," his friend agreed. "I don't know about having him here in the fort. It's like inviting a fox into the hen house." Rebecca stiffened. Could this savage boy be a danger to the fort? Captain Stevens's voice rose above the crowd. "Everyone should understand it's been a long time since Isaac's been with his own people. He speaks Indian now, and a little French. He's forgotten all the English he ever knew. And he's grown up thinking that we're the enemy. It's up to us to show him different." The captain smiled wearily at the crowd of settlers. "We need someone to give the boy a home till his kin come to claim him. It'll only be for a few weeks. Any volunteers?" Mrs. Randolph, the shopkeeper's wife, stood in front of Rebecca. She told her husband, "I wouldn't sleep easy with a boy like that in our house. I'd be afraid he'd attack us in the night." Mr. Randolph nodded in agreement. "I feel sorry for whoever takes that boy in," Rebecca thought. She glanced around to see who the unlucky family might be. No one stepped forward. "It would be an act of Christian charity," Captain Stevens urged. Suddenly, a woman's voice piped up from the back of the crowd. "The boy can stay with me." Startled, Rebecca turned around. It was Widow Tyler who had spoken. She must have awakened from her nap feeling better, Rebecca realized. But why would she invite this savage boy into our home? The widow walked forward. She was a thin woman, and she had once been tall, but now her back was stooped with age. Ever since her illness, she had suffered bad times when she was tired and forgetful. But she also had good times, when she seemed almost as vigorous as she'd once been. This was one of her good times. There was a touch of color in her pale cheeks, and her voice was firm. The crowd separated for her as she drew up to Captain Stevens. She smiled at him. "We have missed you, Phineas. Welcome back." The widow was hard of hearing, and she spoke with a piercing voice. As a long-time resident of the fort, She was one of the few people who called Captain Stevens by his first name. He bowed slightly to the widow. "'Tis good to be back, Abigail, and I'm glad to see you've recovered from your ailments." He gestured at Isaac. "Are you sure you're ready to take on this young man?" Widow Tyler nodded. "It's worked out well enough having the Percy girls." She paused briefly and coughed, then gathered her strength again. "And what is one mouth more?" "Thank ye, Abigail," Captain Stevens said with a smile, and the issue of Isaac's lodging was decided. Rebecca felt filled with dread, but the other settlers relaxed. They began peppering Captain Stevens with questions. "What news have you?" one farmer called out. "Are the Indians up to trouble again?" Captain Stevens looked grave. He told the crowd that there had been an attack near the Merrimack River. The Maloon family had been captured. Another family destroyed by those savages, Rebecca thought angrily. "We've enjoyed peace for a good while, but it looks as if it's coming to an end," Captain Stevens warned the crowd. "Everyone who's living on farms outside the fort should consider moving in, and no one should travel beyond the fort unless absolutely necessary." Old Johnny yelled out from the crowd. "What if our business is travel?" he asked. "What good is a peddler who stays in one place?" "Then you're responsible for your own safety. The soldiers of this fort will not guard you," Captain Stevens told him sternly. "As if they ever did," Johnny mumbled. "And for everyone's safety, no one should leave the fort without a guard," Captain Stevens continued, "especially at night." "I believe in being safe as much as the next man, but there's no call to live like we're in prison," called out James Johnson, a farmer with a soft Irish accent. "My family is staying on our farm. As a matter of fact, Mrs. Johnson and I are having a wee party Friday night." Several people cheered. Mr. Johnson smiled. "Bring your muskets, but prepare to have a good time." Captain Stevens frowned. "This is no laughing matter. Everyone must be watchful. Now excuse me. I'll settle Isaac at the Widow Tyler's." The crowd broke up. Celinda had to return to the cutters with Ezekiel. Rebecca followed Captain Stevens, Widow Tyler, and the Savage Boy back to the widow's cabin. The log house was made up of one main room with a small sleeping loft above it. The big fireplace stood across from the cabin's front door. A long oak table, flanked by benches on either side, sat near the hearth. To the left of the door was the widow's bed, which was partitioned off from the rest of the room by curtains. Widow Tyler pointed at her bed. "We'll take the trundle bed from under my bed and put it over there," she said, motioning to the far corner of the room. Rebecca was surprised to see the widow's new energy. "It's almost as if she's glad the Savage Boy will be staying here," Rebecca thought. They carried the low trundle bed from underneath the widow's tall bed to the empty corner of the room. The widow opened her trunk and pulled out a pair of thin, patched blankets. She showed Rebecca how to hang the old blankets from the rafters so that they enclosed the two open sides of the bed. The blankets did not reach all the way to the floor, but they offered a measure of privacy. Isaac sat cross-legged on the floor as they worked. When they were finished, Captain Stevens spoke in Abenaki to the boy. Isaac muttered a reply. "I told him this is where he'll sleep, and that he's to help you with chores," Captain Stevens explained. The widow nodded. "That'd be fine," she said. "We need some wood chopped." Again Captain Stevens spoke to the boy. Isaac fired back what sounded like a question. "He wants to know if there's food," Captain Stevens translated. The widow smiled. "I know what hungry boys are like. Why, my son Ethan could eat enough for 4 men when he was that age." A shadow came over the widow's face. Rebecca knew she was remembering her beloved only child, who had died in a hunting accident. The widow turned to Isaac and said something in Abenaki. He answered her with a few words. Rebecca's eyebrows shot up. She had no idea that the widow knew the Indian language. Captain Stevens laughed. "I'd forgotten that you and your husband used to trade with the Indians. You remember some of their talk, eh?" "Enough to get by," said the widow with a small smile. "Rebecca, bring the boys some food." Rebecca filled a trencher with hot bean soup. She brought it toward the boy reluctantly, noting a strange odor as she came close to him. "He even smells like a savage," she thought. Isaac grabbed the trencher from her and slurped at the soup. "Ah," the widow said, "it's good to have a boy in the house. Rebecca, be sure to give him cornbread, too." "We're out of cornbread, ma'am," Rebecca reminded her. "We ate the last at noon." "Tisk, tisk," the widow clucked. "I'll go over to the Willards and see if I can borrow some." With an air of purpose, the widow made her way out to the yard. Left alone with Isaac and Captain Stevens, Rebecca asked the captain eagerly, Pray, sir, did you hear any news of my parents or Benjamin on your mission? Any word at all? No, child, the captain said. His tired face looked sad. I inquired many times about your family, but no one knew of them. Oh, said Rebecca. She turned away from the captain. She did not want him to see the tears welling in her eyes. All this time I've hoped and prayed, she thought, and still there's nothing. At last she burst out. 'Tisn't right. Why should Mamma and Papa in bed still be prisoners when a boy like that, she jerked her head at Isaac, a boy who's more Indian than white, is set free? It may not seem right to you, the captain said quietly, but we must not question God's will. Perhaps one of Isaac's kin wants him back as much as you want your family. Rebecca looked doubtfully at the savage boy slurping his soup. How could anyone anywhere want him back as much as I want Mamma, Papa, and Ben, she thought. Suddenly Isaac looked up from his food. He stared coldly at Rebecca as if he sensed what she was thinking. Rebecca felt a little shiver of fear. She turned to Captain Stevens. Sir, are you sure he doesn't speak English? He's forgotten all the English he once knew, said Captain Stevens. It happens when children are taken at a young age. Since he's been with our soldiers, he's learned a few words, like yes and stop. He knows little more than that. Isaac now held his empty dish out to Rebecca. He pointed to the pot on the fire. I suppose he has no need for words, Rebecca said. He makes himself known without 'em. She carried Isaac's dish to the fireplace and filled it half full. Isaac followed behind her. When she turned to hand him his soup, she saw the savage boy rip an apple off the string hanging overhead. He popped the dried ring into his mouth, then began to reach for another. No, Rebecca cried out. Captain Stevens, tell him to stop. The captain spoke sharply, and Isaac lowered his arm. He took the trencher and returned to his place on the floor. I worked hard to put up those apple rings for winter, Rebecca said, glaring at Isaac. Doesn't he know enough not to eat 'em? He's not used to our ways, the captain said. He takes what he needs. Rebecca eyed the boy as if he were a wild and possibly rabid dog. He's a savage, she exclaimed, just like the Indians. No, said Captain Stevens, shaking his head. I know how you feel about Indians, but they aren't savages. I lived with them a long while, and they taught me much. Their ways are different from ours, Rebecca, but they're people. They're God's creatures as we are. Don't forget that. Rebecca avoided the captain's gaze. Yes, sir, she murmured. I was just about Isaac's age when I was captured by the Abenaki, the captain continued. Although it's been many years, I still remember the Indians who were cruel to me. But I also remember everyone who offered me kindness, a place by their fire, warm moccasins to wear, a piece of bear meat. He paused, then asked, How do you want to be remembered, Rebecca? Before Rebecca could reply, Celinda came through the door. She looked at Rebecca, and her eyes asked silently, Does the captain have news for us? Rebecca shook her head slightly. Celinda bit her lip. Then she curtsied low to Captain Stevens. Good evening, sir, she said quietly. Good evening, Celinda, he replied. I was reminding your sister that we should treat Isaac the way we ourselves would want to be treated if we were strangers in a strange land. We'll do our best, sir, Celinda promised. She smiled shyly at Isaac, but he was busy scraping up the last bits of his soup. Let me fetch you more, Celinda offered. She limped to the fireplace. Rebecca noted with dismay that her sister filled the boy's dish all the way to the top. Now there would be little left for their own supper. Sometimes Linda is just too good, she thought to herself. Captain Stevens stood up from the bench. I must leave again tomorrow. I should return by Saturday at the latest. I trust you'll be hospitable to Isaac while I am away. You leave tomorrow, sir? Rebecca echoed. I must ask for his help now, she thought. Pray, sir, may we speak to you about something? Captain Stevens paused, his hand on the door. Yes? It's about Celinda's contract, Rebecca said. She quickly explained how Mrs. Cutter was planning to move back to Connecticut and take Celinda with her. She can't do that, can she, sir? I'm sorry to tell you, Captain Stevens said, but if the Cutters bought Celinda's contract for a year, they're within their rights to take her, just as if they'd bought a horse. They'd every right to take that with them, too. Celinda's not a horse or a slave, Rebecca exclaimed. They didn't buy her. Aye, but when the Cutters bought her indenture, they bought her services for a period of time. In this case, a year, Captain Stevens explained. I know we don't do indentures much here in the fort, but they're common in the cities. The only way I've heard of being released from an indenture before the time is up is to buy the contract back. Do you have enough money to do that? Celinda shook her head sadly. Mrs. Cutter paid £2 for my contract. She says she won't sell it back for a shilling less. All we have now is 3 shillings, said Rebecca. She did some quick calculations. There were 20 shillings in a pound, so they would need 40 shillings in all. We need 37 shillings more. The only valuable things were their own silver spoons. She paused. Do you remember? Captain Stevens nodded. After the girls were rescued, the captain had advised them to keep their spoons hidden and tell no one about them. Some day you may need these spoons, he told Rebecca. For now, you'd best keep them to yourself. Rebecca had followed his instructions carefully, never mentioning the spoons to anyone in the fort. Now she looked to Captain Stevens again for advice. Do you think we should sell the spoons? To buy back Celinda's contract? Rebecca, we can't, Celinda protested. What would Mama say? What would she say if I let you be taken to Connecticut? Rebecca asked her sister. She turned to the captain. What do you think, sir? Captain Stevens stroked his graying beard. I think your mother would believe Celinda is more important than any spoon, he said. You must do what you need to do, Rebecca. 37 shillings is a great deal of money for you to raise. What's this about 37 shillings? Asked Widow Tyler. The old woman entered the house carrying a basket of cornbread and a jug filled with cider. The Willards gave this to me for our visitor, she said. She handed Isaac a large chunk of cornbread and a cup of cider. He ate the food greedily. The widow smiled with satisfaction, then turned to Captain Stevens and asked again, What were you saying about 37 shillings? Captain Stevens told the widow about Celinda's dilemma. 'Twould be cruel for the Cutters to take Celinda away, the widow exclaimed. But I can't say I'm surprised they're leaving. Amelia Cutter thinks she's too fine for Fort No. 4, her with boastful ways and fancy dresses. The widow patted Celinda's arm. I wish there was something I could do to help you, dear, but... Her voice trailed off. An awkward silence filled the cabin. Both the Percy sisters and Captain Stevens knew that the Widow Tyler did not have a single shilling to spare, much less £2. Perchance I could speak to Mrs. Cutter, the widow suggested after a moment. I might persuade her to allow Celinda to stay with us. Rebecca and Celinda exchanged glances. The widow tended to be more honest than diplomatic, and she and Mrs. Cutter had never been friendly. Any conversation between the two women would be likely to do harm more than good. Captain Stevens cleared his throat. That's kind of you, Abigail, but as commander of the fort, I'll speak with Mrs. Cutter. Thank you, sir, Rebecca and Celinda replied together. They looked at each other relieved. Surely Captain Stevens would be able to convince Mrs. Cutter. The captain said something to Isaac. The boy shrugged and returned to his food. I told him to help with cutting wood and other chores you might have, Captain Stevens explained. He reached for the door. Tomorrow I'll stop in before I leave and make sure everything is well. Farewell till then. After the captain left, the room seemed suddenly quiet. Darkness had fallen upon the fort now, and only ashes from the cooking fire lit the cabin. Outside, crickets clicked and frogs gargled their mournful songs. A baby cried in a nearby cabin. The sound of its sobbing was replaced by its mother's soothing lullaby. The widow ate a bowl of soup, then retired to her bed. Isaac silently retreated to his corner and pulled the curtains closed around the bed. Rebecca divided this small remainder of soup between Celinda and herself, frowning as she did so. She had planned the soup to last 2, possibly 3 days. Now it was gone in a single night. Next time you give food to that savage boy, don't serve him so much, Rebecca whispered to her sister. You've always said to be kind to guests, Celinda reminded her. When Reverend Turner stayed with us last spring, you said we should give him the best of everything. Rebecca remembered Reverend Turner well. He was a kind man who reminded her of Papa. Reverend Turner was different, Rebecca told her sister. He was a preacher. Isaac's a savage boy, and he eats like a bear in springtime. Maybe Isaac's hungry because the Indians starved him, Celinda suggested. Maybe he's just greedy, Rebecca replied. And if he keeps eating like he did tonight, we'll be the ones who will starve. Still hungry, the two girls climbed up the ladder to the loft. It was a bare space, not nearly as pleasant as the airy loft they had once shared in their parents' cabin. Their bed was a corn husk mattress on the floor. Eaves slanted sharply down on either side of the floor. A wooden trunk under the eaves contained their few belongings. The two girls hung their dresses on nails driven into the rafters, said their prayers, and climbed into bed. As they lay in the darkness together, Celinda said hopefully, "Perhaps 'twill be good to have Isaac here. Captain Stevens said he'd chop wood for us. You know how you hate to do that." "I don't know if I trust that boy with an axe," Rebecca muttered. "He might think it was a tomahawk and scalp us all." Celinda was horrified. "Rebecca," she whispered, "you don't really believe he'd tomahawk us, do you?" "No," Rebecca admitted, "but I'll keep an eye on him just the same." Celinda soon fell asleep, but Rebecca lay awake in the darkness and worried. She was finally drifting off when the peaceful night was shattered. There was a piercing scream, then a cry of, "No! Stop! No!"